Imagine being shot down over hostile territory, your body broken and bleeding, with enemy soldiers hunting you through frozen forests. Now imagine you're a woman in 1943, when female combat pilots weren't supposed to exist. Picture crawling through snow-covered wilderness for weeks, eating bark and grass to survive, while an entire Nazi regiment searches for you. This isn't fiction. This isn't a movie. This is the impossible true story of Senior Lieutenant Lydia Litviak, the Soviet pilot who refused to die when death seemed certain, who walked 200 kilometers through enemy territory when walking seemed impossible, and who proved that the human spirit can overcome odds that defy belief. What you're about to discover will challenge everything you think you know about survival, courage, and the incredible power of refusing to give up when giving up is the only logical choice. The morning of August 1st, 1943, dawned gray and heavy over the Ukrainian steppes. 21-year-old Senior Lieutenant Lydia Litviak adjusted her flight helmet and ran her fingers along the controls of her Yak-1 fighter aircraft. The plane bore 13 small stars painted on its fuselage, each representing a German aircraft she had personally shot down. But Lydia wasn't thinking about her victories that morning. Something felt different. Wrong. Her squadron had been tasked with a reconnaissance mission deep into German-occupied territory, near the city of Krasnyi Luch. Intelligence reports suggested heavy Luftwaffe activity in the area, but the Soviet command needed eyes on German troop movements. As one of the most skilled pilots in the 586th Fighter Aviation Regiment, an all-female unit that had proven itself time and again against skeptical male counterparts and deadly enemies alike, Lydia had volunteered for the dangerous assignment. The other pilots in her unit called her the White Rose of Stalingrad. Her blonde hair and fierce beauty had earned her attention, but it was her deadly accuracy and fearless flying that had earned their respect. She had joined the Soviet Air Force at 18, lying about her flight experience to gain acceptance into combat training. While other young women her age were working in factories or fleeing from advancing German armies, Lydia had chosen to take the fight directly to the fascist invaders. As her fighter climbed through the morning clouds, Lydia reflected on the path that had brought her to this moment. Born in Moscow to a family of modest means, she had fallen in love with flying as a child, spending hours watching planes practice aerial maneuvers over the city. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, her world had shattered. The comfortable life she had known vanished overnight, as the brutal reality of war consumed everything she held dear. The German advance had been swift and merciless. Millions of Soviet citizens had been killed, wounded, or displaced in the first months of the invasion. Cities had fallen like dominoes. The Wehrmacht had seemed unstoppable. But, rather than flee or despair, Lydia had felt something else entirely, a burning rage that demanded action. She would not stand by helplessly while her homeland was destroyed. She would fight back with everything she had. Her training had been intense and dangerous. The Soviet Union, desperate for pilots, had accelerated the usual programs. Men and women learned side by side, though the women faced additional scrutiny and doubt. Some instructors believed females lacked the physical strength or emotional stability for aerial combat. Lydia had proven them wrong repeatedly, demonstrating reflexes, spatial awareness, and tactical thinking that surpassed many of her male colleagues. Her first combat mission had been terrifying and exhilarating. Flying over the devastated city of Stalingrad, she had encountered a formation of German Messerschmitt fighters. The enemy pilots, confident in their superiority and experience, had underestimated the young Soviet woman. Her first kill had come after a vicious dogfight that lasted nearly 20 minutes, with both aircraft dancing through deadly aerial ballet, until Lydia's superior maneuvering had given her the killing shot. Word of her success had spread quickly through the Soviet Air Force. Female combat pilots were rare enough to attract attention, but one who consistently shot down experienced German aces was extraordinary. Stalin himself had taken notice, awarding her medals and commendations. More importantly, her fellow pilots had accepted her as an equal, recognizing that gender meant nothing in the cockpit when bullets were flying. Now, flying through increasingly hostile skies toward her reconnaissance target, Lydia scanned the horizon with practiced eyes. The landscape below had been transformed by war. What had once been fertile farmland was now cratered and scarred. Villages that had existed for centuries had been reduced to burned ruins. Streams of refugees moved like ants along dusty roads, carrying whatever possessions they could salvage from their destroyed homes. The radio crackled with reports from other Soviet units. German ground forces were massing for another offensive push. Panzer divisions were moving into position. The Luftwaffe had increased patrol frequencies in this sector. Everything suggested that a major battle was imminent, which made Lydia's reconnaissance mission even more critical. Soviet commanders needed accurate intelligence about German positions and strength. As she approached the target area, Lydia noticed something that made her stomach tighten with apprehension. The usual radio chatter from ground control had gone silent. No updates on enemy positions. No weather reports. No communication at all. Either her radio equipment had failed, or something terrible had happened to the command posts that should have been guiding her mission. She continued toward her objective, knowing that turning back without completing the reconnaissance would be considered cowardice. Soviet military doctrine demanded absolute commitment to assigned missions, regardless of personal risk. Pilots who abandoned their duties faced court-martial and possible execution. But, more than fear of punishment, Lydia was driven by a sense of duty to her comrades fighting on the ground below. They needed the intelligence she was gathering. Their lives depended on it. The first sign of trouble came as a glint of sunlight reflecting off metal in the distance. Lydia's trained eye immediately identified the distinctive silhouette of German fighters approaching from the east. From Messerschmitt Bf 109s, flying in perfect formation, clearly on an intercept course. They had spotted her lone aircraft and were moving to engage. Under normal circumstances, facing 4 enemy fighters would have been challenging, but manageable. Lydia had survived worse odds before. Her Yak-1 was nimble and reliable, and her skill as a pilot had been proven in dozens of previous encounters. But something was wrong with her aircraft. The engine was running rough, occasionally missing beats that caused the entire plane to shudder. The fuel gauge showed lower levels than expected for this point in the mission. Rather than flee, Lydia made a tactical decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She chose to continue with the reconnaissance mission, hoping to gather the critical intelligence before engaging the German fighters. Every minute of delay increased the danger, but the information about enemy troop positions was too valuable to abandon. She pushed her aircraft into a steep dive, using gravity to increase speed and hopefully avoid detection by staying close to the ground. The landscape rushed past beneath her wings as she photographed German positions, noting artillery placements, supply depots, and troop concentrations. Her camera clicked repeatedly, capturing images that would help Soviet commanders plan their next moves in this deadly chess game of war. The German fighters had not lost sight of her. They had spread into a hunting formation, attempting to cut off her escape routes while maintaining altitude advantage. Their pilots were experienced veterans of aerial combat, men who had learned their deadly skills in battles across Europe and North Africa. They approached their prey with the confidence of predators who had successfully hunted many times before. When the first burst of machine gun fire erupted around her aircraft, Lydia realized her situation had become desperate. The German bullets tore through the air where her plane had been seconds earlier, missing her cockpit by mere meters. She threw her fighter into a series of violent evasive maneuvers, using every trick she had learned during her training and combat experience. The aerial battle that followed would be remembered as one of the fiercest individual combats of the entire war. For nearly 30 minutes, Lydia fought against overwhelming odds, using her superior knowledge of her aircraft's capabilities to stay alive against 4 determined enemies. She shot down one German fighter in a head-on attack that required nerves of steel and perfect timing. Another enemy aircraft was damaged badly enough to withdraw from the fight, but her fuel was running dangerously low, and her ammunition was almost exhausted. Worse, the engine problems that had begun earlier were becoming critical. Black smoke was beginning to stream from her exhaust, and the rough running was getting worse with each passing minute. She knew her aircraft was dying beneath her, and there was nothing she could do to prevent it. The final attack came from above and behind, delivered by the remaining 2 German fighters working in perfect coordination. Their bullets found their target with devastating effect. Lydia felt the impact as rounds tore through her fuselage, shattering instruments and controls. One bullet grazed her shoulder, spinning her partially around in the cockpit and causing her to lose control momentarily. Her engine seized with a grinding metallic scream that she could hear even over the wind and gunfire. The propeller stopped turning, and her aircraft began falling toward the earth like a wounded bird. The German fighters circled above her, watching their victim fall, occasionally firing additional bursts to ensure she would not recover. Through blood and pain, Lydia struggled to maintain some control over her dying aircraft. She managed to level out the dive somewhat, trading altitude for distance as she searched desperately for somewhere to attempt a crash landing. The ground rushed up toward her with terrifying speed, and she knew she had only seconds to find a suitable spot. Below her stretched a patchwork of fields, forests, and small villages. Most of the terrain was unsuitable for landing, covered with trees or obstacles that would destroy her aircraft and kill her instantly. But she spotted a small clearing in a wooded area, perhaps large enough for a crash landing if she could manage to reach it. With her last bit of control authority, Lydia guided her aircraft toward the clearing. The impact was violent and devastating. Her fighter hit the ground at tremendous speed, bouncing and sliding through tall grass before smashing into the tree line at the far end of the field. The sound of tearing metal and splintering wood filled the air as her aircraft disintegrated around her. When the wreckage finally came to rest, Lydia found herself hanging upside down in what remained of her cockpit, held in place only by her flight harness. Blood ran down her face from multiple cuts and gashes. Her left arm hung at an unnatural angle, clearly broken. Her legs were trapped beneath twisted metal, and she could not feel her feet. But she was alive. Against all odds, she had survived one of the most violent aircraft crashes imaginable. The German fighters had departed, apparently convinced that no one could have survived such a destruction. They were wrong. Lydia Litviak, the white rose of Stalingrad, was still breathing, still thinking, and still determined to continue fighting. As consciousness faded in and out, she became aware of voices in the distance. German voices, speaking in the harsh consonants of their native language. Enemy soldiers were approaching her crash site, probably sent to confirm her death and recover any useful intelligence from the wreckage. They would be surprised to find her alive, but that surprise would quickly turn to opportunity. A captured Soviet pilot, especially a female ace, would be valuable for propaganda purposes. Summoning strength she didn't know she possessed, Lydia began working to free herself from the wreckage before the German soldiers arrived. She had to escape. She had to survive. And somehow, impossibly, she had to make it back to Soviet lines to report what she had seen during her reconnaissance mission. The greatest test of her life was about to begin. Everything that had happened before, all her victories and achievements, would mean nothing if she failed in the next few minutes. The war had taken everything from her except her will to fight. Now she would discover whether that would be enough to carry her through the darkness that lay ahead. The taste of blood filled Lydia's mouth as she hung suspended in the twisted remains of her cockpit. Every breath sent sharp pains through her ribs, and the metallic tang reminded her just how close she had come to death. The German voices were getting closer, their boots crunching through the debris field that surrounded her demolished aircraft. She could make out at least 3 different speakers, probably a patrol unit sent to investigate the crash. Working with desperate efficiency, Lydia began freeing herself from the safety harness that had both saved her life and now trapped her in this inverted metal coffin. The buckle release mechanism had been damaged in the crash, bent and jammed by the violent impact. She pulled a small knife from her flight suit and began cutting through the canvas straps, each slice bringing her closer to freedom, but also closer to discovery by the approaching enemy soldiers. Her left arm screamed in protest with every movement. The break was clearly severe, probably in multiple places based on the way it refused to respond to her commands. But her right arm still functioned, and that would have to be enough. She had learned during her combat training that the human body could endure incredible damage and continue functioning if the mind remained focused and determined. The first strap parted with a soft tearing sound. Then, the second. She was making progress, but the German voices were much closer now. She could hear them calling to each other, coordinating their search of the crash site. One voice, deeper and more authoritative than the others, was giving orders. Probably an officer or sergeant leading the patrol. As she worked on the final strap that held her in place, Lydia caught fragments of German conversation that made her blood run cold. They weren't just investigating the crash. They were specifically looking for the pilot, and they knew she was female. Word of her reputation had apparently spread even to enemy units. They wanted to capture the famous Soviet ace alive for interrogation and propaganda purposes. The last strap finally gave way, and Lydia collapsed downward into the inverted cockpit with a muffled crash that she hoped the approaching soldiers hadn't heard. For a moment, she lay still among the broken instruments and scattered debris, fighting waves of nausea and disorientation. Her body wanted to rest, to give in to the trauma and shock of the crash. But her mind knew that survival depended on immediate action. Carefully, she began extracting herself from the wreckage. The cockpit opening had been partially crushed in the impact, creating a narrow gap barely wide enough for her slender frame. She pulled herself through the twisted metal, ignoring the sharp edges that tore at her flight suit, and opened new cuts on her arms and legs. Each movement was agony, but each inch of progress brought her closer to escape. The forest floor outside the cockpit was soft with fallen leaves and moss, providing blessed relief after the hard metal surfaces of the destroyed aircraft. Lydia lay flat for several precious seconds, allowing herself to assess her injuries more carefully. Besides the broken left arm, she had multiple cuts and bruises covering her entire body. Her right ankle was badly sprained, but still functional. Most concerning was a deep gash on her scalp that was bleeding heavily, creating the risk of leaving a trail that enemy trackers could follow. She tore strips of fabric from her flight suit and created makeshift bandages for the worst wounds. The head injury required special attention. She packed moss and leaves against the cut, then wrapped the improvised dressing tightly with cloth strips. It wasn't medical-grade treatment, but it would have to serve until she could find better supplies. The German patrol was now close enough that she could hear individual footsteps among the debris. They were being methodical in their search, checking every piece of wreckage for signs of the pilot. It would only be minutes before they discovered that the cockpit was empty and realized she had escaped alive. Once that happened, they would begin a more intensive search of the surrounding forest. Lydia forced herself to stand, testing her injured ankle and finding that it would bear her weight despite the pain. The broken arm would be a constant challenge, but she could manage one-handed movement if necessary. More important was the question of direction. Which way led towards Soviet lines, and how far would she have to travel through enemy-controlled territory? During her reconnaissance flight, she had noted several landmarks that could help with navigation. A river flowed roughly east-west about 10 kilometers south of her current position. Following that waterway eastward should eventually lead her toward areas still under Soviet control. But the journey would take her through heavily patrolled German positions, past military installations, and across terrain that offered little cover or concealment. She began moving through the forest as quietly as possible, using skills learned during survival training to minimize noise and avoid leaving obvious tracks. Every step had to be calculated. Broken branches or disturbed undergrowth could provide clues for pursuing German soldiers. Her bleeding wounds were a particular concern, as drops of blood on leaves or moss would create an unmistakable trail leading directly to her hiding places. Behind her, she heard shouts of excitement from the crash site. The patrol had discovered her escape. Within minutes, they would be radioing for additional units to join the search. The entire German garrison in this sector would soon be hunting for the famous Soviet pilot who had dared to shoot down their aircraft, and then escaped from what should have been certain death. The forest offered both advantages and dangers for someone in her situation. The thick canopy provided concealment from aircraft that would inevitably join the search. Streams and rocky areas could help mask her trail from ground trackers. But the same dense vegetation that hid her also slowed her progress and created noise that could betray her position to listening enemies. As she moved deeper into the woods, Lydia began to appreciate the full scope of the challenge she faced. This wasn't simply a matter of walking home through friendly territory. She was a wounded woman traveling alone through hundreds of square kilometers of enemy-occupied land. German patrols, collaborating local militia, and even hostile civilians could all pose deadly threats. She had no food, limited water, no medical supplies, and no way to communicate with friendly forces. But she also possessed advantages that her enemies might not expect. Her flight training had included extensive instruction in navigation, survival techniques, and evasion tactics. She could identify edible plants and locate water sources. She understood how to read terrain features and weather patterns. Most importantly, she had an unshakable determination to return home and continue fighting against the fascist invaders who had destroyed so much of what she loved. The first stream she encountered was small but clear, probably fed by underground springs that kept it flowing even during the dry summer months. She knelt carefully and drank deeply, filling her stomach with the cold, clean water. Then, she followed the stream eastward, walking in the shallow water when possible to eliminate footprints and scent trails that tracking dogs might follow. The water was shockingly cold, even in the August heat. Each step sent icy spikes of sensation up her legs, but it was a discomfort she could endure. More concerning was the way her broken arm throbbed with increased intensity whenever she stumbled on the rocky streambed. The bone fragments were grinding against each other with each jarring step, creating waves of nausea that threatened to overwhelm her. She had been walking for perhaps 2 hours when she heard the first sounds of pursuit behind her. Dogs barking in the distance, their calls echoing through the forest as they worked to pick up her scent trail. German voices shouting coordinates and search patterns. The methodical crashing of multiple search teams moving through the undergrowth in organized sweeps. The enemy was taking her escape seriously. They had committed significant resources to recapturing her, which meant her reputation as a pilot was even more valuable to them than she had realized. Being taken alive would be worse than death. She would be interrogated, tortured for military intelligence, then displayed as a propaganda trophy to demonstrate German superiority over Soviet forces. That knowledge gave her strength to ignore the pain and exhaustion that threatened to stop her progress. She increased her pace, pushing through the burning sensation in her injured ankle and the constant agony radiating from her broken arm. Behind her, the sounds of pursuit grew gradually closer. The tracking dogs were following her scent successfully, and their human handlers were experienced woodsmen who knew how to read signs and predict the behavior of fleeing quarry. The stream she had been following eventually joined a larger waterway flowing roughly in the direction she needed to travel. This river was too deep to wade through safely, especially with her injuries, but it offered other opportunities. Fallen logs and debris had accumulated along the banks, creating natural hiding places where she could rest and observe her surroundings without being detected. She found a particularly good position beneath a massive fallen tree that had created a natural shelter when it toppled across the riverbank. The space underneath was dry and concealed, providing a perfect observation post overlooking the area she had just traversed. From this vantage point, she could watch for pursuing enemy soldiers while planning her next moves. The wait was not long. Within 30 minutes, she heard the approaching search teams working their way along the stream she had followed. The dogs were clearly following her trail, their excited barking indicating they were close to their quarry. But when they reached the junction where she had changed direction, confusion set in. The scent trail had been disrupted by the flowing water and the complex odors of the larger river. She watched through a gap in the fallen logs as German soldiers emerged from the forest. There were at least a dozen men, all carrying rifles and moving with the disciplined coordination of experienced troops. Several carried submachine guns. One soldier held the leash of a large tracking dog that was circling frantically, trying to reacquire the lost scent trail. The patrol leader, a sergeant based on his uniform markings, was consulting a map and giving orders to his subordinates. They were splitting into smaller groups to search both directions along the riverbank. Some would follow the water eastward, which was exactly the direction Lydia needed to travel. Others would search westward and back through the forest they had just covered. As she watched the enemy soldiers organize their search pattern, Lydia realized she had gained only a temporary reprieve. The tracking dog would eventually pick up her scent again, probably within hours. She needed to put much more distance between herself and her pursuers, but moving during daylight hours increased the risk of being spotted by aerial patrols or encountering other German units. The solution came to her as she observed the river flowing past her hiding place. Several large pieces of driftwood were floating downstream, carried by the current toward the east. If she could find a way to travel with the current, she could move faster than walking while leaving no trail for the tracking dogs to follow. But swimming in her condition would be extremely dangerous. The broken arm made it impossible to maintain proper stroke technique. Her other injuries would sap her strength quickly in the cold water. If she lost consciousness or cramped up while swimming, she would drown just as surely as if the Germans had shot her. She needed some kind of flotation device that would allow her to drift with the current while conserving her strength. Looking around her hiding spot, she spotted several empty metal containers that had been washed against the fallen tree by previous floods. With some modification, they might provide enough buoyancy to keep her afloat during a downstream journey. Working as quietly as possible, Lydia began preparing for the most dangerous part of her escape attempt. She lashed the metal containers together using strips torn from her flight suit, creating a crude but functional life raft. The construction was slow and painful work with only one usable arm, but eventually she had assembled something that might carry her several kilometers downstream before she would need to return to land. The German search teams had moved out of sight, following the riverbank in both directions as their sergeant had ordered. But she could still hear their voices and the occasional bark from the tracking dog. They would be back when they failed to find her trail in either direction. This was her opportunity to escape, but it required entering the water immediately. She slipped from her hiding place and waded carefully into the river, testing the current and the stability of her improvised flotation device. The water was even colder than the stream had been, shocking her system and making her broken bones ache with renewed intensity. But the current was steady and strong, capable of carrying her eastward at a speed she could never match on foot through the difficult forest terrain. Taking a deep breath to steady her nerves, Lydia committed herself to the river and began the next phase of her incredible journey home. Behind her, the sounds of the German search teams grew fainter as the current carried her away from immediate danger. But ahead lay hundreds of kilometers of enemy territory, countless unknown dangers, and challenges that would test every skill and instinct she possessed. The White Rose of Stalingrad was far from home, badly wounded, and completely alone in hostile territory. But she was alive, free, and determined to make it back to continue her war against the enemies who had taken everything she held dear. The river carried her eastward toward an uncertain fate, but also toward the possibility of an impossible victory against overwhelming odds. The river carried Lydia eastward through a landscape transformed by war. What had once been peaceful farming communities were now abandoned ruins. Their inhabitants either fled or killed during the German advance. Burned-out farmhouses dotted the riverbank like broken teeth, their blackened walls standing as monuments to the destruction that had swept across this region. The silence was profound and unsettling, broken only by the gentle gurgling of water around her makeshift raft and the distant sound of military vehicles moving along roads she could not see. Her improvised flotation device was holding together better than she had dared hope, but the constant immersion in cold water was beginning to take a serious toll on her already weakened body. Her broken arm had swollen grotesquely, and the improvised splint she had fashioned from pieces of her flight suit was cutting off circulation to her fingers. Worse, she was beginning to experience the early stages of hypothermia despite the summer heat. Her body temperature was dropping dangerously low from prolonged exposure to the river water. She had been floating for nearly 6 hours when she spotted the first signs of major German military activity ahead. A bridge crossed the river about a kilometer downstream, and she could see vehicles moving across it in both directions. Troop trucks, supply convoys, and what appeared to be armored vehicles were all using this crossing point. More concerning were the machine gun positions she could identify on both sides of the bridge, clearly positioned to control river traffic. There was no possibility of floating past such a heavily defended position during daylight hours. The German soldiers would spot her immediately, and she would be captured or killed before she could reach the safety of the far side. She needed to get out of the water and find an alternative route around this obstacle, but leaving the river meant returning to the dangerous business of overland travel through enemy-occupied territory. She guided her raft toward the eastern bank, using her good arm to paddle clumsily toward a section where overhanging trees provided some concealment from observation. The landing was awkward and painful, with her broken arm striking the rocky riverbank as she struggled to pull herself from the water. The shock of impact sent waves of nausea through her entire body, and for several minutes she lay motionless among the reeds, fighting to remain conscious. When her vision cleared, Lydia began taking stock of her situation with the methodical analysis she had learned during her pilot training. Her physical condition was deteriorating rapidly. The broken arm was clearly becoming infected, based on the red streaking she could see spreading up from the fracture site. Her other injuries were healing poorly due to constant movement and inadequate nutrition. Most seriously, she was beginning to experience periods of confusion and disorientation that suggested her body was approaching complete exhaustion. But she had also made significant progress towards Soviet lines. Based on landmarks she had observed during her reconnaissance flight, she estimated she had traveled at least 30 kilometers from the crash site. The river had carried her much faster and farther than she could have managed on foot, and the pursuing German search teams would have no idea where she had left the water. She had bought herself time and distance, both precious commodities in her current situation. The area around the German bridge position was obviously too dangerous for direct approach, so she would need to travel inland and find another crossing point farther downstream. This meant several days of overland travel through territory that was actively patrolled by enemy forces. She would need to move only at night, hiding during daylight hours, and somehow find food and water along the way. Her first priority was finding suitable shelter where she could rest and recover some strength before continuing the journey. The forest near the riverbank offered several possibilities, but she needed something more secure than a simple hiding place among the trees. German patrols would be searching this entire area as part of their ongoing security operations. She found what she was looking for about 2 kilometers inland from the river. An old root cellar, probably built by farmers to store vegetables through the winter months, had survived the destruction that had claimed the farmhouse it once served. The entrance was concealed by overgrown vegetation, and the underground chamber was dry and reasonably warm. Most importantly, it was completely invisible from the surface unless someone knew exactly where to look. Lydia settled into this refuge as darkness fell over the devastated landscape. For the first time since her aircraft had been shot down, she felt reasonably safe from immediate discovery. The cellar was large enough to allow her to stretch out fully, and the earth walls provided excellent insulation from both the cold night air and any sounds she might make while resting. But rest was a luxury she could barely afford. Her broken arm required immediate attention if she hoped to continue traveling. The swelling had increased dramatically during her time in the river, and the improvised splint was now cutting deeply into her flesh. Using her knife and strips of cloth, she carefully removed the old bandages and examined the injury by touch in the darkness of the cellar. What she discovered was deeply alarming. The fracture was clearly compound, with bone fragments that had shifted during her escape from the aircraft wreckage. The surrounding tissue was hot and swollen, indicating serious infection had set in. Without proper medical treatment, the infection could easily spread throughout her system and kill her just as effectively as any German bullet. She had no antibiotics, no proper surgical instruments, and no way to set the broken bones correctly. But she did have her pilot's training in emergency first aid, and she understood the basic principles of wound care. Working entirely by touch in the complete darkness of the cellar, she began the agonizing process of cleaning and resplinting her injured arm. The pain was extraordinary, far worse than anything she had experienced during the aircraft crash or her escape through the forest. Several times she had to stop the work and bite down on a piece of cloth to prevent herself from crying out loud enough to attract attention from any German patrols that might be operating in the area. But gradually, she managed to create a more effective splint and binding system that would protect the fracture site, while allowing her some limited use of the arm. When that ordeal was finally complete, Lydia turned her attention to the equally critical problem of finding food. She had eaten nothing since a light breakfast before her reconnaissance mission, and her body was beginning to consume its own muscle tissue to maintain basic functions. The forest around her hiding place might contain edible plants, berries, or other natural food sources, but finding them in the darkness without making noise that could betray her location would be extremely challenging. She remembered lessons from her survival training about plants that were safe to eat even when found in unfamiliar territory. Pine needles could be chewed for their vitamin content and mild nutritional value. Certain types of moss were edible and could provide some calories. Even tree bark from specific species could be ground up and consumed if no other options were available. Working her way carefully through the forest around the cellar, Lydia began gathering whatever natural food sources she could identify by touch and smell. It was slow, careful work that required her to crawl on hands and knees to avoid being silhouetted against the night sky. Every few minutes she would freeze and listen for sounds that might indicate approaching enemy soldiers. The results of her foraging expedition were meager but potentially life-sustaining. She had collected several handfuls of pine needles, some moss that tasted bitter but seemed safe to consume, and strips of inner bark from what she believed was a birch tree. None of it was appealing as food, but all of it contained nutrients that her body desperately needed to continue functioning. Back in the relative safety of the root cellar, she chewed methodically through her foraged meal while planning the next phase of her journey. The German bridge position would require a significant detour, probably adding at least 2 days to her travel time. But she had noticed during her earlier observations that the enemy forces seemed concentrated around major transportation routes and strategic points. The areas between these positions might be less heavily patrolled, offering opportunities for a careful traveler to move undetected. Her best option appeared to be traveling southeast for several kilometers before turning back toward the river at a point well downstream from the bridge. This route would take her through less militarily significant terrain where German patrols would be less frequent. The trade-off was that it would also take her farther from the most direct path towards Soviet lines, adding precious time to a journey where every day increased her risk of capture or death. As she settled down to rest during the remaining hours of darkness, Lydia reflected on how dramatically her life had changed in less than 24 hours. Yesterday morning, she had been a decorated Soviet pilot, respected by her peers and feared by her enemies. She had commanded a powerful aircraft capable of destroying enemy forces and defending her homeland. Now she was a wounded refugee hiding in an abandoned cellar, reduced to eating bark and moss while trying to evade capture by the same enemies she had once hunted from the sky. But her core identity remained unchanged. She was still a soldier of the Soviet Union, still committed to fighting against the fascist invasion that had brought such suffering to her people. Every kilometer she traveled toward friendly lines was a victory against the enemies who assumed she was dead. Every hour she remained free was proof that the German war machine was not as invincible as their propaganda claimed. The physical challenges she faced were enormous, but perhaps even more difficult were the psychological pressures of her situation. The constant fear of discovery, the awareness that capture meant torture and death, the grinding uncertainty about whether she would ever see home again. These mental burdens threatened to overwhelm her just as surely as her physical injuries and exhaustion. She forced herself to focus on immediate, practical concerns rather than the overwhelming scope of her predicament. Tomorrow night, she would begin the overland detour around the German bridge position. She would need to identify safe hiding places for the following day, locate water sources along her route, and somehow find additional food to maintain her strength for continued travel. The sound of aircraft engines passing overhead reminded her that the enemy possessed advantages she could never match. German reconnaissance planes were probably searching for her during daylight hours, using aerial observation to coordinate ground patrols. Radio communications allowed enemy units to share information instantly across vast areas. She was a single injured person trying to evade an entire military machine designed to control this territory and eliminate threats like herself. But she also possessed advantages that her enemies might underestimate. Her pilot training had taught her to think tactically, to assess threats and opportunities with the same analytical skills she used in aerial combat. Her small size and ability to move silently gave her access to hiding places that would be impossible for larger groups of soldiers. Most importantly, she was fighting for her homeland and her life, motivations that could drive human beings to achieve seemingly impossible feats. As dawn approached, bringing with it the renewed danger of enemy patrols and aerial surveillance, Lydia prepared for another day of hiding and waiting. She positioned herself in the deepest corner of the root cellar, arranged debris to conceal the entrance, and settled down to endure the long hours until darkness would allow her to continue the journey. The sound of heavy vehicles moving along nearby roads reminded her that she was still deep in enemy territory, surrounded by thousands of German soldiers who would consider her capture a significant prize. But she was alive, free, and moving steadily towards safety. Against all odds, the White Rose of Stalingrad was keeping her promise to return home and continue fighting for everything she believed in. The next phase of her incredible journey would test her skills, courage, and determination even more severely than the challenges she had already overcome. But she had proven to herself and her enemies that she possessed the strength to survive situations that should have killed her. Now she would discover whether that strength was enough to carry her all the way home. The third week of Lydia's journey began with a morning that would test every survival skill she had learned and push her beyond the limits of human endurance. She had been traveling for 18 days since her aircraft crashed, covering nearly 200 kilometers through enemy territory while evading capture by an increasingly frustrated German garrison. Her route had taken her through destroyed villages, across contested farmland, and around military installations that bristled with weapons and alert sentries. Her physical condition had deteriorated drastically during those weeks of constant movement and inadequate nutrition. The broken arm had healed badly, leaving her with limited mobility and constant pain that never fully subsided. Her body weight had dropped by at least 20 pounds, leaving her gaunt and skeletal. Most concerning was the persistent fever that had developed over the past few days, suggesting that infection from her various wounds was spreading despite her efforts to keep them clean. But she had also learned skills that no military training could have taught her. She could move through hostile territory with the silence of a hunting animal, reading the landscape for signs of enemy activity, and finding hiding places that would escape detection even by experienced trackers. She had learned to identify edible plants, locate clean water sources, and navigate by the stars with an accuracy that would have impressed professional wilderness guides. The morning that would change everything began when she discovered fresh tire tracks crossing her intended path. The tracks were deep and wide, indicating heavy military vehicles had passed this way recently. More troubling was the direction they were traveling. Instead of following the main roads that German forces typically used, these vehicles had been moving cross-country through areas that should have been relatively free of enemy activity. Lydia crouched behind a fallen tree and studied the tracks carefully, using techniques she had learned during her pilot training for analyzing enemy movements. The pattern suggested a convoy of at least 6 vehicles, probably trucks carrying troops or supplies. The depth of the impressions indicated they were heavily loaded. Most importantly, the tracks were fresh enough that dust had not yet settled in the tire marks, meaning the convoy had passed this location within the past few hours. This discovery presented her with a terrible dilemma. Her planned route would take her directly across the path the convoy had followed, but doing so risked encountering additional German forces or walking into a prepared ambush. The alternative was another significant detour that would add days to her journey, while she was already weakened by exhaustion and malnutrition. Every day of delay increased the risk that her deteriorating physical condition would make continued travel impossible. She decided to shadow the convoy route for several kilometers, hoping to determine its destination and identify any opportunities to safely cross their path. Moving parallel to the tire tracks while staying far enough away to avoid detection required extraordinary care. The terrain offered little natural concealment, forcing her to crawl through tall grass and hide behind scattered rocks whenever she heard engines in the distance. After following the convoy trail for most of the morning, Lydia discovered something that made her blood run cold. The German vehicles had stopped at a small village that she had planned to skirt on her journey eastward. But this was not a routine patrol or supply stop. The soldiers were systematically searching every building, questioning local civilians, and setting up what appeared to be a permanent checkpoint operation. From her concealed observation position on a hill overlooking the village, she could see German soldiers going door to door with photographs, obviously looking for someone specific. The realization hit her like a physical blow. They were searching for her. Somehow, the enemy had determined her approximate location and was conducting a systematic sweep operation designed to capture the famous Soviet pilot who had embarrassed them by escaping from certain death. The implications were terrifying. If the Germans knew roughly where she was located, they would be setting up similar checkpoint operations throughout the region. Every village, every crossroads, every bridge or ford would soon be monitored by troops who had been shown her photograph and given orders to capture her alive. The net was closing around her with methodical German efficiency. But the sight that truly shook her was what happened next in the village below. An elderly man, probably in his 70s, was dragged from his home and forced to kneel in the village square. A German officer was shouting questions at him, obviously demanding information about whether he had seen a Soviet pilot. When the old man shook his head repeatedly, indicating he knew nothing, the officer drew his pistol and shot him without hesitation. Lydia watched in horror as other villagers were brought forward for similar interrogation. Men, women, even children were threatened with death unless they provided information about the escaped pilot. The Germans were using collective punishment tactics, making it clear that civilians would die until someone told them what they wanted to know. The knowledge that innocent people were being murdered because of her presence in the area filled Lydia with a rage that burned through her exhaustion and fear. These were her people, Soviet citizens who had done nothing except have the misfortune to live in territory that had been overrun by fascist invaders. Now they were dying because she had survived when she should have perished with her aircraft. But that rage also crystallized her resolve in ways that nothing else could have accomplished. She would not allow their deaths to be meaningless. She would survive this ordeal and return to continue fighting against the enemies who considered civilian murder an acceptable military tactic. Every kilometer she traveled towards Soviet lines was justified by the innocent blood being spilled in that village square. The checkpoint operation made her planned route completely impossible. The Germans had positioned their forces exactly where she needed to travel, and They would be maintaining heightened security for days or weeks until they either captured her or concluded she had escaped the area. She needed a completely different approach, one that would take her around the entire search zone while somehow maintaining progress toward her ultimate destination. Studying her mental map of the region, Lydia identified an alternative route that would take her far to the north before curving back toward the east. This path would add at least a week to her journey and require crossing several major rivers without bridges. But it would also take her through heavily forested terrain where German patrols would be less frequent and where her survival skills would give her the greatest advantage. The decision to take this longer route meant accepting that she might not survive the additional time required. Her physical condition was already marginal, and extending the journey by a week could easily prove fatal. But the direct route was now impossible, and attempting it would result in certain capture and probable execution after interrogation. She began the new phase of her journey that very night, moving north through terrain that was even more difficult than anything she had previously encountered. Dense forest alternated with swampy areas that were nearly impossible to traverse without leaving obvious tracks. Streams and small rivers created natural barriers that required careful planning to cross safely. Worst of all, the heavily wooded environment made navigation extremely difficult, forcing her to rely on brief glimpses of stars through the forest canopy. Her food situation had become critical during the past week. The natural sources she had been relying on were becoming scarce as autumn approached, and her weakened condition made foraging increasingly difficult. She was consuming far more calories than she was taking in, and her body was beginning to shut down non-essential functions to preserve energy for basic survival. The solution came from an unexpected source. On her fourth night of following the new route, she discovered an abandoned German supply cache hidden beneath a camouflaged tarp in a forest clearing. The cache contained canned food, medical supplies, ammunition, and other equipment that had been stockpiled for use by patrol units operating in this area. Most importantly, it included items that could dramatically improve her chances of survival. Lydia approached the cache with extreme caution, aware that it might be booby-trapped or under surveillance by German forces. She spent nearly an hour circling the site and observing it from different angles before finally concluding that it had been genuinely abandoned, probably during a recent redeployment of troops to more active sectors of the front. The medical supplies alone were worth the risk she had taken to investigate the cache. Antiseptic solutions, proper bandages, and even some antibiotics that could help fight the infection that was slowly poisoning her system. She carefully cleaned and redressed all of her wounds, using techniques she remembered from her military first aid training to give herself the best possible chance of recovery. The food was even more precious than the medical supplies. Canned meat, dried biscuits, and chocolate provided more nutrition than she had consumed during the entire previous week. She forced herself to eat slowly and moderately, knowing that her shrunken stomach could not handle large quantities of food after weeks of near starvation. But even small amounts of proper nutrition began restoring her strength almost immediately. Best of all was a detailed German military map that showed the positions of checkpoints, patrol routes, and supply lines throughout the entire region. The map was marked with annotations in German, but Lydia's basic knowledge of the language allowed her to understand the most important information. She could see exactly where the search operations were concentrated and identify areas where German presence was minimal. Armed with this intelligence windfall, she revised her route once again, choosing a path that would take advantage of gaps in German coverage while avoiding the heaviest concentrations of enemy forces. The new route was still longer than her original plan, but it offered much better prospects for avoiding detection while making steady progress towards Soviet lines. She also took several items from the cache that would improve her chances of survival during the remaining weeks of her journey. A small compass eliminated her navigation difficulties. A waterproof poncho provided protection from the autumn rains that were becoming more frequent. Most importantly, a signal flare could be used to attract attention from friendly forces if she managed to reach contested areas where Soviet patrols might be operating. As she prepared to leave the cache site, Lydia reflected on how dramatically her situation had improved in just a few hours. Yesterday, she had been a dying woman struggling through hostile territory with inadequate equipment and failing health. Today, she had proper medical care, sufficient food, and detailed intelligence about enemy positions. The discovery of the abandoned supplies felt like divine intervention, a sign that her survival was meant to serve some larger purpose. But She also understood that this stroke of good fortune only increased her responsibility to succeed in reaching Soviet lines. The innocent civilians who had died because of her presence in their village deserved to have their sacrifice count for something meaningful. The intelligence she had gathered about German positions and tactics could help save other Soviet soldiers and pilots. Her survival story could inspire others to continue fighting even when victory seemed impossible. The remainder of her journey would still require weeks of dangerous travel through enemy territory. German forces were actively hunting for her with increasing desperation as news of her survival became an embarrassment to their military reputation. The approaching winter weather would create new challenges and dangers that could kill her just as effectively as enemy bullets. But for the first time since her aircraft had been shot down, Lydia felt confident that she would actually make it home. She had survived impossible odds through skill, determination, and an unshakable refusal to give up when giving up would have been the rational choice. The White Rose of Stalingrad was still alive, still fighting, and still determined to return to the war that had taken everything she loved except her will to continue the struggle. The final phase of her incredible journey was about to begin, and she would face it with renewed strength and unwavering resolve to prove that the human spirit could triumph over any odds when fighting for something greater than personal survival. The morning of October 15, 1943, brought the first heavy frost of the approaching winter, coating the landscape with a crystalline layer that made every step treacherous and every breath visible in the frigid air. Lydia pulled the German poncho she had taken from the supply cache more tightly around her shoulders. But the thin material provided little protection against the bitter cold that seemed to penetrate directly to her bones. She had been walking for 6 weeks since her aircraft crashed, covering nearly 400 kilometers through enemy-controlled territory, and she was finally approaching areas where the front lines remained fluid and contested. The improvement in her physical condition since discovering the abandoned German cache had been remarkable. Proper food and medical supplies had given her body the resources it needed to begin genuine healing. Her broken arm, while still weak and painful, had regained much of its mobility. The persistent infections that had threatened her life were finally under control. Most importantly, she had recovered enough strength to maintain the grueling pace of night marches that would be necessary to cross the remaining distance to Soviet lines. But the approaching winter created new challenges that were potentially more dangerous than anything she had faced during the warmer months of her journey. Temperatures were dropping rapidly as autumn gave way to the harsh Russian winter that had defeated so many invading armies throughout history. Snow was beginning to fall with increasing frequency, creating both opportunities for concealment and risks of exposure that could kill her within hours if she made critical mistakes. The tactical situation had also changed dramatically as she moved closer to active combat zones. German rear area security operations were being reinforced by frontline troops who possessed combat experience and professional military skills far superior to the garrison units she had evaded during the earlier phases of her journey. Patrol patterns were more sophisticated, communication networks were more robust, and the consequences of detection would be immediate and lethal rather than merely leading to capture and interrogation. But she was no longer the desperate, wounded pilot who had crawled from her destroyed aircraft 6 weeks earlier. The hardships of her journey had transformed her into something approaching a professional wilderness survival expert. She could read terrain features and weather patterns with intuitive accuracy. Her ability to move silently through hostile territory had been refined through constant practice under the most demanding conditions imaginable. Most importantly, she had developed an unshakable confidence in her ability to overcome obstacles that would have seemed insurmountable when her ordeal began. The German map she had taken from the supply cache indicated that Soviet forces were operating in the area approximately 50 kilometers ahead of her current position. But reaching that zone would require crossing the most heavily defended section of her entire journey. Multiple German defensive lines, artillery positions, and supply bases blocked the most direct approaches to the front. Enemy air activity was constant, with reconnaissance aircraft and ground attack planes maintaining surveillance over every road and open area. Her route planning had to account for all of these factors while somehow maintaining progress toward her objective. The solution she developed was audacious in its simplicity. Rather than attempting to sneak through or around the German defensive positions, she would follow their own supply lines eastward, moving parallel to the roads and communication networks that connected rear areas with frontline units. This approach offered several advantages that outweighed its obvious dangers. German supply convoys traveled these routes regularly, creating noise and disturbance that would mask her own movement. The roads were cleared of obstacles and monitored for enemy activity, reducing her risk of stumbling into Soviet patrols or partisan units that might shoot first and ask questions later. Most importantly, the supply routes led directly toward the areas where she was most likely to encounter friendly forces. She began implementing this strategy on the night of October 16th, positioning herself alongside a major German supply road that ran southeast toward what her map indicated was a significant artillery position. The road carried heavy traffic throughout the night hours, with trucks, armored vehicles, and staff cars moving in both directions as the German army maintained its positions along the extended front lines. Staying close enough to the road to benefit from the concealment provided by the traffic while remaining far enough away to avoid detection required extraordinary skill and patience. She had to judge the timing of vehicle movements perfectly, using the sound of approaching engines to mask her own movement through the roadside vegetation. Every few hundred meters, she would stop and carefully observe the traffic pattern, looking for opportunities to cross open areas without being silhouetted against the night sky. The technique worked brilliantly for the first several hours of travel. She was making faster progress than at any time since beginning her journey, covering ground at nearly twice the rate she had achieved during cross-country movement through difficult terrain. But the approach also created new dangers that became apparent when a German convoy stopped directly adjacent to her hiding position for what appeared to be a routine maintenance check. She found herself lying motionless in a drainage ditch less than 20 meters from German soldiers who were checking tire pressure and examining their vehicles for mechanical problems. For nearly 30 minutes, she remained perfectly still while enemy troops worked within easy speaking distance, occasionally shining flashlights in her direction as they moved around their vehicles. One soldier relieved himself so close to her position that she could have reached out and touched his boots. The experience was simultaneously terrifying and educational. She learned that German supply units were much more casual about security procedures than frontline combat troops. These soldiers were focused on mechanical issues and maintaining their movement schedule rather than searching for enemy infiltrators. They made noise, used lights carelessly, and generally behaved like men who considered themselves safe from immediate danger. When the convoy finally resumed its journey, Lydia waited nearly an hour before emerging from her hiding place and continuing eastward. The close encounter had demonstrated both the risks and the opportunities associated with her new approach. She could use the enemy's own confidence and routine procedures against them, but any mistake in timing or positioning would result in immediate discovery and death. Over the following nights, she refined her technique for shadowing German supply convoys while avoiding detection. She learned to read the patterns of their movement, identifying when vehicles would stop for rest breaks or mechanical problems. She discovered that German drivers often used the same rest areas night after night, allowing her to predict where delays would occur and plan her own movement accordingly. Most importantly, she began gathering intelligence about German military operations that would be invaluable when she finally reached Soviet lines. She observed artillery positions being resupplied with ammunition, noted the movement of reserve units toward threatened sectors of the front, and identified supply depots that would make excellent targets for Soviet air attacks or partisan raids. The breakthrough moment in her journey came on the night of October 21st, when she encountered something that filled her with hope for the first time in weeks. The distant sound of artillery fire, rumbling through the cold night air like thunder from an approaching storm. But this was not the random, sporadic firing she had heard occasionally during her journey. This was sustained, organized bombardment that could only mean active combat operations were taking place nearby. Where there was fighting, there would be Soviet forces. Her people were close enough to hear, probably close enough to reach within a few more nights of careful travel. The realization that her ordeal was nearing its end filled her with an energy and determination that made the cold, exhaustion, and constant danger seem suddenly manageable. She adjusted her route toward the sound of the artillery fire, leaving the German supply road she had been following and striking out cross-country toward what she hoped would be her salvation. The terrain became increasingly difficult as she approached active combat zones. The landscape was cratered by shell impacts, littered with abandoned equipment, and scarred by the trenches and earthworks that marked shifting battle lines. But she also began seeing signs that lifted her spirits with each passing hour. abandoned Soviet equipment that had been left behind during retreats but not destroyed by advancing German forces. Shell fragments with Cyrillic markings that proved Soviet artillery was active in this area. Most encouraging of all, the bodies of German soldiers who had clearly been killed recently, indicating that her countrymen were fighting back effectively against the fascist invaders. The climactic moment of her incredible journey came at dawn on October 23rd, exactly 6 weeks, and 3 days after her aircraft had been shot down behind enemy lines. She was crossing what had once been a wheat field when she heard voices speaking Russian in the distance. Not the harsh German consonants she had learned to fear, but the familiar sounds of her native language being spoken by men who might be able to help her reach safety. She approached the voices with extreme caution, aware that German forces often included Russian-speaking soldiers recruited from prisoners of war or occupied territories. But, as she got closer, she began hearing distinctly Soviet military terminology and references to Red Army units that no German imposter would likely know. These were genuine Soviet soldiers, probably a patrol unit operating in the contested zone between the main battle lines. When she finally revealed herself to the patrol, the young Soviet soldiers initially refused to believe her story. A woman claiming to be a famous pilot, appearing alone out of enemy territory after walking for more than 6 weeks, seemed too incredible for rational acceptance. But she knew details about Soviet Air Force operations, aircraft specifications, and military procedures that convinced them she was genuinely who she claimed to be. The patrol leader, a sergeant who had been fighting against German forces for 2 years, listened to her account with growing amazement. He had heard stories about the female pilot known as the White Rose of Stalingrad, and, like most Soviet soldiers, he had assumed she had died when her aircraft was shot down weeks earlier. The discovery that she had not only survived but had walked home through hundreds of kilometers of enemy territory was almost beyond belief. Within hours, Lydia found herself in a Soviet field hospital, receiving the first professional medical care she had experienced since beginning her ordeal. Military doctors marveled at her survival, noting that her injuries should have been fatal without immediate treatment. Her weight loss was so severe that she barely resembled the confident pilot shown in official photographs. But she was alive, coherent, and able to provide detailed intelligence about German positions and operations she had observed during her journey. News of her survival spread through the Soviet military with the speed of wildfire. The story of the pilot who had refused to die, who had walked home through enemy territory against impossible odds, became a powerful symbol of Soviet resilience and determination. Her intelligence reports helped plan artillery strikes and air attacks that destroyed several of the German positions she had identified during her journey. But, perhaps most importantly, her survival proved that the human spirit could triumph over circumstances that seemed designed to guarantee failure. She had faced odds that should have killed her dozens of times during her 6-week ordeal. Enemy soldiers, severe injuries, starvation, disease, exposure, and pure exhaustion had all tried to stop her progress. None had succeeded. The White Rose of Stalingrad had kept her promise to return home and continue fighting. Her incredible journey through enemy territory had ended, but her war against the fascist invaders who had taken so much from her people was far from over. She would fly again, fight again, and prove once more that determination and courage could overcome any obstacle when fighting for something greater than personal survival. Lydia Litviak had defied death itself and walked home to prove that heroes are not born from easy victories, but forged in the fires of impossible challenges that test every limit of human endurance. Her story would inspire countless others to continue fighting when fighting seemed pointless, to keep moving when movement seemed impossible, and to never surrender when surrender appeared to be the only rational choice. Against all odds, she had made it home. The incredible journey was complete, but the legend was just beginning.